Today, I'm going to be reviewing the LG G6 Android smartphone. It's one of the first flagship smartphones that we've seen and tested for 2017. Now, a quick refresher on the LG line. LG, like Samsung, like HTC, every year tries to do something a little bit different with their phones to make them differentiate not only from each other, but from their own smartphones of past years. Now, last year with the LG G5, LG introduced a modular system, an accessory system that lets you swap out the bottom of the phone and buy third-party accessories like a new headphone DAC or also a beefier camera system. It didn't work out quite well for LG. Now, I'm happy to say that with the LG G6, they've reversed directions and made a more simple, elegant phone, not without some of its own interesting features, which we'll dive into. Now, first of all, there is no removable battery on this phone. I know that's gonna be a turnoff for a bunch of people. That went the way of the modular system, but it is a beefier battery, a 3,300 milliamp hour battery, and in my use, gives you about 8 hours of web browsing and productivity, a little more than you need for a full day of regular use. I'm pretty happy with that. Now, other features that LG has put in the LG G6 include making it waterproof. There's also wireless charging, and there's Qualcomm's fast charging, and a fingerprint reader in the back and USB-C on the bottom. They've also kept the headphone jack, 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, thankfully, but they've kept it on the top of the phone, which is different than what some other phone manufacturers have been doing by putting it on the bottom of the phone. And while storage is limited to 32 gigabytes or 64 gigabytes of what you can buy of internal storage, they also thankfully kept expandability with a micro SD card slot right next to where you would put the SIM card. Performance-wise, under the hood, there's a Qualcomm Snapdragon 821 processor that runs this phone. And that's an interesting design decision because the Snapdragon 821 is last year's high-end Qualcomm chip. It's the same chip that runs the OnePlus 3T and the Google Pixel phone, and a lot of flagships we anticipate this year, including the upcoming Samsung Galaxy S8, run the Snapdragon 835. Now, in day-to-day use, it really didn't mean much. Benchmarks on the LG G6 were right in line with the OnePlus 3T and other Snapdragon 821 phones, but on browsing websites and watching video and playing games, performance is pretty great. We're getting diminishing returns, I think, with these new processors every year, especially when we're talking about how they affect battery life. Again, a full day of battery use with this phone design. But let's talk about the more interesting features. Now, I said earlier, it's really interesting to me seeing how phone companies map out their roadmaps, what new and weird features they want to put into their phones to differentiate it, their new flagships. Some of those features end up sticking, like fingerprint readers, higher resolution screens, making them waterproof, USB-C, and some of those features just end up being actual gimmicks, like the modular accessories. With the LG G6, we have one feature that's been grandfathered in from last year's G5 that I do like and I hope sticks around, and that's the camera system. So the LG G6 has two sets of cameras, two cameras on for front-facing and two cameras for world-facing. For the world-facing cameras, you have your standard two 13-megapixel cameras. The lenses are actually flush with the back of the phone, thankfully this year, and one is your 28mm equivalent, very comparable to a 28 or 35mm camera that you'd find on most smartphones. It does have optical image stabilization and it has 13 megapixels and a pretty wide aperture of 1.8. But it's really that second camera that I'm interested in because LG, unlike the Apple, for example, putting in a portrait mode telephoto lens on their second camera, LG put a wide angle lens on their cameras, on the LG G5 and now the LG G6. And I am completely enamored with this wide angle lens. It's really almost fisheye, about a 12mm equivalent, and I found it so useful in creating distinct shots indoors with groups, even landscape shots, and especially when filming video with that wide angle lens. On the front-facing camera, you also have your standard 70-degree angle camera and also a wide-angle lens, and wide-angle selfies with people look really, I think, really cool. Now, image quality-wise, I wasn't all that impressed with the camera. I don't think it compares favorably with the Google Pixel camera phone or even the iPhone 7 camera phone. You can, of course, shoot some of these images in RAW and do some post-processing afterward, but the noise is pretty high in low light imagery and autofocus was pretty slow. If you look at the actual specs of the camera modules, these are pretty old sensors that LG has put on these phones. I hope they upgrade that, but that didn't happen this year. But while the image quality didn't blow me away, again, I am really enamored with that wide-angle lens. In fact, I'd love to see a smartphone manufacturer design a phone with a dual lens system that doesn't use 28mm or 35mm. Give me a wide angle and give me a telephoto for portraits. That's what I'd want in the future. Now, the feature that really makes this phone stand out as a flagship this year, and I think sets a trend for phones going forward this year and next, is the way the display is made. Look at that display. Look at that screen. Look at how little bezel there is on the screens. Ever since we had the first smartphones back in 2007, we wanted less forehead and less chin. And with the LG G6, we have a whole lot less bezel on the chassis. In fact, the screen takes up about 80% of that front face. You still need a little bit for the camera system and the speaker system and the logo on the bottom, but everything else is basically screen. We're seeing phones like the Galaxy S8 also take this approach, and the expectation is that the newest iPhone later this year will also do that. Now, the other attribute about the screen that I think is going to be trend-setting is also the aspect ratio and resolution of this screen. The pixel dimensions of this phone are 2880 by 1440. LG says that's 18 by 9, but let's call it what it is. It's 2 by 1. The screen is twice as tall as it is wide. And even though it's 5.7 inches, that changes the way we think about how big phones are, because they're more rectangular, less square than ever. We're way past 4:3 screens or even 16:9 screens these days. And what that means, combined with the minimal bezel, is that you have a phone that has a footprint that's smaller than that of, for example, an iPhone 7 Plus, but with a screen that's bigger and, in my opinion, more useful. Now, in Android, not every app supports 2:1 or 18:9 aspect ratio perfectly just yet. Web browsing, using social media apps, that's just fine. You're just gonna see more text and be able to see more without scrolling. But video applications are where things get a little bit weird. For example, using Netflix. There's some Netflix content, a lot of it in fact, that's 16:9. That's just a very traditional HD TV aspect ratio. And in Netflix, you're gonna get black bars on the left and right. There's no option right now to maximize the screen and crop off the top and bottom. But some content is actually being filmed in 2:1 aspect ratio. Stranger Things, House of Cards, a series of unfortunate events, that's all 2:1. And to take advantage of that, you actually have to enable and turn the app into a compatibility mode, which cuts off some of the UI, but gives you that full screen. And let me tell you, watching Stranger Things in 2:1, filling up this screen is, well, it's magical almost. It's really, really cool. Unfortunately, watching video in other programs like YouTube, for example, you're gonna get your black bars, even if you're watching content that was shot in widescreen or closer to 2:1. Watching a movie trailer, for example, shot but in 2.2:1 aspect ratio, you get the hard-encoded black bars on the top and bottom. And you also get the black bars on the left and right, because YouTube, for some reason, that app I can't stretch to fill 2:1 and maximize that video. So we're still going through some growing pains with this aspect ratio, but for a lot of content does look great. Now, the IPS LCD screen that LG has put in this phone also goes up to 600 nits of brightness. That's really bright. And it's one of the first phones that supports HDR in Dolby's specifications, Dolby Vision. Now, unfortunately, there's not a lot of content that supports Dolby Vision right now. There's a included video that you can use as a sample, but for streaming services, Amazon has promised Dolby Vision support for some of its shows like Bosch and Man in the High Castle, but streaming that right now on the Prime Video app on Android, you're not gonna actually be able to take advantage of that. At least I couldn't notice the difference. That's gonna be a feature set that you're gonna be able to take advantage of hopefully later this year. So at the end of the day, the LG G6, it's a high-end phone with a high-end price. This is a $700 phone. And there are a lot of still questions that remain in terms of software. LG hasn't had the best track record in updating its Android software for its older phones. The LG G5 got Android Nougat 7.0 about 2.5 months after it was released in the summer, and the phone, the LG G6, here actually ships with 7.0, not even 7.1. I don't know how much of that matters to a lot of people. For me, day-to-day use, it still has most of the features I want, and I can download something like the Google Now Launcher to make it feel more like a stock phone. But there's also what's in the field. Like I said, Samsung has its Galaxy S8, their flagship phone, high-end $700, $800 phone that's going to come out in just a couple weeks. I'd hold off on picking up the LG G6 until we see the S8 actually release and we can compare those two directly. But there's a lot to like in the LG G6, especially in its form factor. I love the wide-angle camera, and I do think this minimizing of bezels and these taller screens are here.